Good afternoon, Texas Realtors. I hope you're all starting off a great week, and we're all glad to have you here today to do an 88th Texas Legislature recap. So thank you for all joining us today. And just to cover a couple of housekeeping items, we'll be going over our presentation today. There will be an opportunity for you to engage and ask questions on the chat part of the Zoom session, and then that way we'll be able to try to get to as many of your questions as we can possibly. And as we get those, we will try to answer your questions. So thank you for being here with us today. We're looking forward to kind of going over kind of what the legislature and recap of what we have experienced through the last regular session and currently now where we are in the current first special session. So just getting started with that presentation, we'll just go ahead and start off with the idea that during this regular session, we started tracking a number of bills. And just as a side note, this was a record session in the number of bills that we saw filed. It was over 8,000 bills, which is a record for the legislature. So it must be just an overcompensation for all the COVID year session that we've been dealing with, but apparently the legislature felt like there were a lot of issues that need to be dealt with, and they filed a absorbent amount of bills. And we ended up tracking about 1,848 of those bills that were related to Texas Realtors priority positions, things that we wanted to make sure were things that were important to Texas Realtors, not only with respect to the real estate profession, but also the real estate industry, how policy is set related to things around real estate, all the same conversations we had with our public policy teams throughout the interim in establishing through our volunteer system all the important things that we care about as Texas Realtors. So 1,848 bills is a lot for us to keep track of. And just wanted to give you a few more stats here. Of those, there were 295 bills that Texas Realtors supported, which means active engagement, various levels of engagement to support those bills. And right under that, you see it says that we saw 53 of those bills get passed. Now, I'll remind you all, the legislative session is not something that is an easy process. The legislature is not designed to pass a lot of bills. It is a process that's very arduous. I don't know if you ever saw how to make a bill, how that process works. You have to go through the House, you have to go through the Senate, or in reverse order, and it has to get through all these major thresholds to then get to the governor's desk to get signed into law. So a lot of processes for a bill to fail. And so of the ones that we saw that we supported, 295, 53 of them made it through the bicameral process, which means they got to the governor's desk. And so we're excited about that because that outperforms the typical bill pass ratio for the legislature. And before we get into what happened this last weekend with vetoes and stuff, we saw a pass rate of about 15% of all bills in the legislature. And with this number here, we're at 25% of the bills that get passed that Texas Realtors supported. And so we're outperforming a normal bill pattern of passage by another 10%, which is exciting to say that's because Texas Realtors influence and the support we get from all of our members. Realtor Day, we're about to talk about that shortly. There's a whole lot of things that go into how we are able to outperform the typical legislative process. But that's just a little snippet for you to take into. Now, you see, we also opposed 155 bills. That is a lot of bills. And it's a lot of bills probably beyond what we typically see in a normal legislative session. And it felt like there were especially a lot more bills this session. But you will note that we're batting 1,000 in our opposition. So we did good on that. We made sure that none of those bad bills got passed. There were a number of bad ideas, and your Texas Realtors team was very successful in making sure no bad ideas got across the threshold. So we're very happy about that statistic. And we're also excited that we were able to move bills in the support range at a much higher clip than a typical bill goes. So that's just some of the little facts at first, but then let's get into the themes of the session. What we saw going into this session was a extensive amount of surplus revenues from the last biennium that was created from excess sales taxes, oil and gas revenues. All these different things were contributing to the state legislature outperforming our budget expectations to the point of $32.7 billion. Now that's with a B. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in a record way that Texas has ever seen in excess surplus. And so we know the major theme going into this session was, how are we going to spend those dollars? And so there are a couple of conversations about, obviously property taxes was going to be the first thing that is a thing that we need to look into. Additionally, there was a lot of conversation around infrastructure. Investing in infrastructure. These are one-time dollars that come to us. This is not dollars we expect to see every session. So the idea was, let's use one-time dollars for one-time investments and make some real major infrastructure investments so that the future of Texas is bright. So we supported those themes. We agreed that property tax relief was something that we wanted to see as far as how we could spend those surplus dollars, plus investing in additional infrastructure. And in the conversations and our policy conversations, all of those ideas were supported. Additionally, there was another theme that kind of took away from the focus of the policy arena of where we typically focus our attentions. And we had to deal with some of these high-profile controversies that were happening during session. And you'll see that there was an expulsion of a House member, Brian Slayton, was removed from office in House District 2 for his behavior. And then also there was a House investigation and impeachment of Attorney General Ken Paxton. Thankfully, that didn't happen until the very end of session. That was kept very quiet until the very end. And we were thankful for that, because it could have clouded up a lot of the work we were trying to do on the policy side and really mucked up the whole process and our ability to navigate through that process to make sure our public policy positions were moved through. So thankfully for us, that was moved to the very end. And but that was certainly a high-level controversy. The Attorney General is no small thing to have impeached. So he's currently no longer in office or not serving at this moment until the Senate is able to meet and have their trial. That will happen later this summer, likely, and we'll wait to see how that goes. Texas Realtors typically doesn't get involved in these types of issues. This is not something we are engaging in at all. We're just watching the process to see how and what comes of it. But what I do want to highlight is this last bullet point. This is an area where we saw disagreement among leadership during this session almost from day one. We had the speaker and the lieutenant governor going at each other for quite some time all through the session, mostly around the property tax proposals that they both had. And so that created a lot of tension that we had to navigate through and deal with. And it did impact a lot of how we handled a lot of this legislative agenda that we were working on. It impacted the party politics, and it also created some turmoil within the Republican Party as well. So it was definitely a thing that we had to deal with, and it actually is still going on now. So even through the regular session, we did not get a property tax bill passed. And it's still going on through the special session. We'll get into kind of some of the particular issues later on, but I just wanted you to know that was a big theme that we had to deal with during session, and it's still happening today. So moving on from that, we also, let's get into kind of what we were focused on during this session. The Texas Realtor priorities were, as you see here, this is our Realtor Day pamphlet that we handed out during Realtor Day. And you'll see that it covers big, broad ideas like property taxes, infrastructure, housing affordability, economic development, property rights, and basic transactional issues. We wanted to focus on these policy areas based on the bills that were filed and how we felt like we could navigate through this session. And this looked to be a really good slate for us to work with during session. And we're excited about taking this to Realtor Day and having all the realtors show up for Realtor Day to help us with these legislative ideas. And so while I mentioned Realtor Day, let's go ahead and jump in on that information. We had an amazing Realtor Day at the Texas Capitol. This was like a very unique Realtor Day at the Texas Capitol because we had an additional theme layered on top of that, which was the NAR Riding with the Brand that President Kenny Parcell has been pushing across the country. And Texas made a big splash with the Riding with the Brand program, which added the Riding with the Brand bus to come to Austin to be here for our Realtor Day at the Texas Capitol. It included the motorcycle raffle. We had the Realtor Ride with the Brand motorcycle here on site. We also had a huge attendance, and I think it had a lot to do with the cross promotion of Realtor Day at the Capitol and the Ride with the Brand promotion. We were able to help local boards fund some of their transportation costs to get here. And we had about 3,500 realtors show up on Realtor Day. That is a record day for Texas realtors for Realtor Day at the Texas Capitol. And we're excited to have that because that is a big deal. Everyone across the street at the Capitol are like, oh my goodness, when are the realtors going to show up? Because you guys clog the hallway. So we need to make sure we stay out of your way. It's an amazing day. Everyone at the Capitol knows the realtors are in town. And we made a big splash on that day. As a matter of fact, we served so much barbecue, over 1,700 plates were served at the Texas Realtor building, which is a huge amount of food. So much that our vendors going, I'm not sure we can do this anymore if you guys keep growing. So it was a big deal. We're trying to figure out what that vendor needs going to be for next time, because you know how we are at Texas Realtors. We always make it bigger and better. But this is a big event. It worked out great. We're excited about it. We had 178 legislative meetings scheduled in that short period of time when you all were here in town in Austin. And it was a very effective use of our time because the timing, as you can see on March 22nd, was the perfect time for us to have a Realtor Day at the Capitol. It was after the legislature kind of did its initial setup of what the session's going to be doing. It also had already established the committee structure, the committee leadership, and had already started having hearings about some of these key bills that we were working on. And so that was the perfect moment for us to have all of you show up to help push ahead all of our realtor agenda items and make sure that they move through the process. And guess what? After you guys showed up, it started happening. So thank you for all of your efforts to send 3,500 people to Austin to make sure that our legislative Realtor Day was an amazing day, and it was. So now let's dive into some of the main issues that we dealt with during the legislature, and I'll pass it on to Julia.
Thank you, Trey, and welcome everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Julia Parento. I'm your policy director here, and we also have Seth Juergens with us, who is going to help us walk through some of the particular legislation we worked on, and Seth is our Associate Director of Policy here for Texas Realtors. So thank you for joining us today. Trey started out with talking about that budget surplus that was so big, so historic, and what are we going to do with all that money? And that we were so excited for the opportunity to have conversations with the legislature about the long-term planning for our public infrastructure. That means a lot of different things. Our policy committee on infrastructure covers a wide range of issues, but some of the basics that we always talk about are transportation, water and utilities. We started including broadband into our infrastructure conversation a couple of years ago, and it really came to a head, of course, in 2021, while we were all in the middle of a legislative session and the COVID-19 pandemic. It also includes schools and all sorts of other things. But sometimes you have to pick and choose, even with $32 billion in excess revenue. And so this year, the issues that rose to the top really were a continuation of the broadband legislation that the legislature worked on in 2021 and water. So we'll start with the broadband. HB 9 and HJR 125, House Bill 9 and House Joint Resolution 125 that were authored by Representative Trent Ashby, and then Senate Bill 1238 by Chairman Robert Nichols. He chairs the Transportation Committees. Mr. Ashby and Mr. Nichols led the charge in 2021 on broadband reform, and the legislation that they succeeded in passing last session created a new Office of Broadband Development under the State Controller's Office. And that office is designed to really start figuring out how we can get better broadband infrastructure built out to the parts of the state that don't currently have it. This is by and large our more rural communities, though there is conversation in that office about connectivity issues in urban areas as well. It's not solely a rural problem. So there might be some different solutions you look for depending on whether you're talking about a more developed area versus a rural one. So the office was created last session. They gave it an initial boost of funding, and this year they came back to give it more money, better structure, and to set it up to make sure that Texas is poised to be able to draw in federal funding. Congress passed the Infrastructure and Jobs Act in 2022, and that had some good money earmarked for Texas. And sometimes we have to come back and make sure that the legislature has a process set up so we can take that money. And that's largely what Senate Bill 1238 did. House Bill 9 and House Joint Resolution 125 created and added money to the fund that's really going to do the work to get those broadband projects up and running. The House had originally proposed putting $5 billion into that fund. That got whittled down a bit as we went through the legislative process, and the legislators had to make some choices on appropriations, but they wound up with $1.5 billion added to that fund, which is a really great start. And we're excited to see what they're going to be able to do with that money. On water, and again, please make sure you drop your questions in the chat. On water, the water bills were authored by Chairman Charles Perry in the Senate and sponsored by Chairman Tracy King in the House. Tracy King chairs the Natural Resources Committee in the House, and Chair Perry does the Water and a whole bunch of other things committee in the Senate. And so they work together to create the new Water Supply for Texas Fund. And this is a low interest loan fund to look at how we can develop some new water sources. There are parts of our state that have water. There are lots of parts of our state that don't have any. And then there's the middle part of the state that sometimes has water and sometimes doesn't, depending on how bad our drought conditions are. So the legislature does kind of, and this is a pun absolutely intended, ebb and flow in its focus on water issues. And we haven't had a strong water session in probably 10 years following the last really, really bad droughts. But they did renew their interest in it this year, and we were grateful for that. This is a long-term conversation. In no way do we expect that Senate Bill 28 and Senate Joint Resolution 75 are going to be the last we talk about water, not even in the near future. There's a lot of other things to be discussed about techniques for collecting water, like how we may capture water runoff, rainwater, how we can look at desalinization, retention pools, all sorts of things. But this one, as I said, creates the new water supply fund, and I believe they put about $1 billion into that as well. So we are very excited about that. These really broad and critical infrastructure conversations obviously mean so much to the clients that y'all serve, to all of us who live in communities, big or small, across Texas. We need good water. We need electricity that works. We need roads that can get us to the houses that we want to live in. And so that's why Texas Realtors focuses so closely on all of these issues. There is an asterisk on the House Joint Resolution 125 on the broadband and Senate Joint Resolution 75 on the water issue That means that there will be 2 ballot measures, constitutional amendments for us all to vote on come the November election that support this legislation. So we don't have proposition numbers for those yet. There were 13 in total joint resolutions that will amend the state constitution on the November ballot that passed the legislature this year. These are 2 of those 13. And the Secretary of State typically will assign them proposition numbers sometime in August. So just stay tuned on that. You certainly will be seeing some material from Texas Realtors when we get the numbers for those propositions. So you can look toward what we'll all be voting on in November. I will take a breath there and see if we have questions. Seth, do you want to cover House Bill 5? Do you want me to?
Sure, yeah. Happy to jump in, Julia. So again, my name is Seth Jurgens. I'm the Associate Director of Public Policy here at Texas Realtors. House Bill 5 was actually kind of a long time coming. In the 87th legislative session, we saw the expiration of Chapter 312 and 313 agreements. These are economic development agreements where businesses will come in and they'll reach an agreement with the local ISD in the terms of the 313s. And what they'll get is they'll get either severely discounted or let's say, M&O property taxes. What we saw a lot with that, while it was almost viewed as a necessity to compete with a lot of these other states that are offering these kinds of incentive programs to bring businesses to their state, what we saw, the argument it seemed, was that this was kind of a corporate welfare of sorts, that we were giving this money to people who were going to come here regardless whether or not they received that money, and that taxpayers didn't feel like they were getting their money's worth in this situation. So those programs expired last year or last session during the 87th legislature. And we have been looking at taking kind of a new step toward that. So HB 5 is that new step. Chairman Todd Hunter did a great job working on this with his legislative colleagues. They really went through, they talked a lot about this in the interim and trying to formulate a package that they believed would be more transparent with this property or with the taxpayer, but also providing the incentives that we need to compete with other states. The program we ended up here with kind of accomplishes both of those goals. What it does is it establishes that they can get these economic development incentives while establishing that you can only get so and so much based on how big your project is or how many jobs it's actually providing. This was kind of a governor's priority. I know that he is a big fan of these programs and utilizing them. Here you'll actually see the Tesla Gigafactory and Samsung's new plant. If any of y'all driven out to Taylor, just kind of east of Austin, you've seen the probably 50 cranes that are dotting the sky right now and building that huge new Samsung factory. So that's really where we came from here. It's going to be monumental, I think, in pushing Texas forward and keeping Texas business competitive. Moving on to kind of our next group, we can talk about affordable housing. Julia, you want to hop back in on that?
For sure. Housing affordability, not a topic that we necessarily have spent a lot of time discussing with the Texas legislature. We have by and large been very fortunate from a statewide perspective. Of course, local markets always may have differences in their nuances. But we have been really an affordable state for housing for a long time. We've been fortunate in our space, in our development policies, in our ability to draw people here and find places for them. That, of course, has been changing. And really, it's been changing very quietly, very slowly for a long time. Some research that NAR helped produce in 2021 actually showed that Texas has been underbuilt for housing units for a long, long time, nearly 2 decades. But it's one of those slow creep problems that you don't necessarily notice right away until it's too late. And too late really came when your markets across the state got crushed by demand during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so housing affordability became a topic of conversation that the legislature was worried about. And from our perspective, it's a conversation we were really looking forward to having with the legislature. It's there's no silver bullet to fix affordability problems that you might be seeing in your markets. There are contributing factors at the local, state, national, and even global levels when we look at supply chain issues, different labor policies, all sorts of building regulations and requirements that state and local municipalities might have. It's a big problem, but we try to help where we can. So we looked at some options at the state legislature to try to really reduce some of the regulatory burden that impede our community's ability to get houses on the ground, to make sure we have an adequate supply of housing for the people who want to live in our various cities and counties. So there were a number of bills that we were supporting under the housing affordability umbrella. If you go back and look at the Realtor Day priority bills that Trey mentioned earlier, there are quite a few on that list. Ultimately, of those, House Bill 14 was the one that passed. And let me just quickly mention a couple that didn't. There was a bill that would have made it far easier for folks who own single family homes to have accessory dwelling units on their properties. And these are, the carriage house above your garage, the what we used to call mother-in-law apartments with a separate entrance around the back of the house. That's an accessory dwelling unit. And some cities allow them and many cities do not. And so the legislature looked at making this more of a by right issue, but while still allowing municipalities to have regulatory authority over how those units are constructed and who can occupy them. I think it's fair to say that legislation was a bit wide open as far as the property owner's right to have an accessory unit on their property, the way it was filed through the legislative process. As we always see with bills like this, it got refined into a space that was much more palatable to a lot of people. But I think there were still some lingering concerns that maybe came out of how it was originally filed, or maybe just came out of some misinformation that folks had. People were really worried that they would be overrun by, party houses, short-term rentals, all sorts of things like that. The bill, as it got amended, still allowed for local regulations on all those kinds of things. Ultimately, it did not pass out of the House, but I think it's a conversation that will come back again next session. There was another bill that we were supporting, another set of bills that would have created a threshold for minimum lot sizes in certain cities, and the certain cities were really defined on population. It was a bill that applied primarily to our largest, most urban cities, and it would have set a lower threshold for how big an individual single family lot could be required to be. That is one of the barriers that we hear about, particularly in developing communities where, and it's lovely in some areas where we're able to have very large lot sizes, and in some other circumstances that inhibits our ability to develop an adequate supply of housing. So for certain communities, there would have been a lower lot size threshold that cities would have been able to keep new development to. That also did not ultimately pass. It did, again, the as filed was a much smaller number. The bill got amended to allow for far bigger lots, about 3 times the size of a lot as it originally had been filed. But concerns still remained, and that one did not make it across the finish line either. But House Bill 14 did, and when you see a low number like that, you can consider it a priority of the chamber's leadership. In the House, you'll see how bill numbers 1 through 20 that are Speaker of the House priority legislation. In the Senate, they typically use Senate bills 1 through 30. So if you see those numbers, you can be confident that it's something that the leadership is working on in addition to the bill author. So House Bill 14 by Realtor Cody Harris actually will help streamline municipal development permitting when cities are not able to meet certain timelines for paperwork or getting inspections done that you need to get certificates of occupancy, that kind of thing. This legislation will allow the property owner, the property developer, to contract with a third party with some caveats. They have to have some qualifications, of course, that's all set up, and get that paperwork moving. So we are looking forward to see if this kickstarts some development across the state of Texas. And we were excited to see one of those housing affordability, removing the red tape bills get passed. And we think that in upcoming legislative sessions that the other bills and new ideas that we haven't even talked about yet will probably be on the table to further that conversation. All right. I think that takes us to property rights. Seth, you went off camera. Are you able to take this one? There you go.
Yeah, so in regards to property rights, two of the larger pieces of legislation we engaged on this year were House Bill 93 by Chris Turner and House Bill 1750 by Chairman Dwayne Burns. House Bill 1193 by Representative Turner actually arose from a situation that I'm sure many of y'all saw up in the Metroplex dealing with Providence Village. What we saw there was, in the midst of existing leases, the Property Owners Association decided to bar the leases that were accepting Section 8 housing vouchers. What this legislation is intended to do is say that a property owners association cannot bar any specific sort of payment. It doesn't require that you take a specific sort of payment, but it doesn't allow the HOA to bar you from accepting the form of payment of your choice. House Bill 1750 was another one you probably heard a lot about, another Metroplex related piece of legislation. What we saw were cities in the unincorporated area, not unincorporated, in the kind of ETJs within cities. They were seeing where maybe a local farmer had planted a crop and saying, hey, you need to mow this down, looking at it as a nuisance or as a weed instead of as a crop. And so the situations we saw where cities would come in and actually just mow down planted agricultural products. And so what this legislation is geared toward is guaranteeing your right to pretty well to grow your agricultural products and to be able to utilize certain agricultural or to avoid certain agricultural restrictions on your property that is within the boundary of a city. So those are those two. What you'll see there, as Julia noted earlier with House Joint Resolution 126, is that this will actually be another one of the 13 items that you'll be voting on in November constitutional elections. So something to keep an eye out for as well. I'm sure you'll see a lot of talk on this over the next couple of months in the form of newspaper articles and commercials and everything else as they try to get the word out about this important ballot measure. Moving on from there, looks like we'll be going into real estate transactions. Trey, do you want to talk about the importance of this one? I think you're on mute, Trey.
And before I jump into that, I see a lot of comments related to property taxes. We will address that here shortly. So we'll talk about the source of why we have excess revenues and where that came from. And then we'll talk about the various discussions related to the property taxes and where we've been involved in that conversation. So please hold your horses. We're almost there. But right now, let's talk about real estate transaction. There was a bill, HB 19, as Julia mentioned, it's one of those low number bills, which the leadership was involved in. And this was one of their priorities because they felt like it was going to be really important for Texans to have a business-friendly court. And the reason for that is and it's also limited to $10 million or more in disputes relating to values of significant amounts. So when you get into a conflict related to tens of millions of dollars, if not more, I'm sure there's going to be a very detailed and technical approach to how and why there's a dispute here. And there's a lot to explain to the court, and a whole lot of fact finding, and a whole lot of witnesses, and a whole lot of very specialized conversation happening around that type of business. So the leadership felt like we should have a court that understands business practices, business models, and how businesses transact business, so that when a complaint comes to court, at least that court has some knowledge about various business practices that they can lean into, so that it's not spent a whole lot of time. If you've ever been to court, there's a whole lot of time trying to educate not only the jury, but also the judge on very minute particular items related to a business practice and to why this dispute exists. So hopefully this court will help minimize some of that time spent on attorney fees, so we can try to learn all the facts. And maybe this process will be a little bit more streamlined and easier for businesses to navigate through this process. And that's why this legislation was passed and moved along by leadership. And we felt like that might be an add to anybody involved in the real estate world, typically dealing with millions of dollars, and being able to have a way to streamline through this process. So that's HB 19. I want to move on to something that we're also excited to share with you. The Texas Real Estate Commission and Real Estate Research Center bill that we helped to foster through the process. We're really excited this one got across the finish line. It is signed by the governor and enacted into law to be effective on January 1st. The really interesting thing about this one is there are some kind of mundane things about the bill. It really updated outdated language in the TREC statutes. It had information in there back from the days that TREC started back in the 70s. And so it had a lot of formation language in there that we're way past all of that. I think TREC's going to be around for a while. So we're going to kind of clean up some of that language in the statute to make sure it's just very, very particular to the operations of TREC, and rather than the formation of TREC. And we also made sure that the thing that was interesting for us that we wanted to make sure was fixed, TREC, when TREC moved from a annual license to a 2-year license, there was a little section of the statute that messed with the funding for the Real Estate Research Center at Texas A&M. Because the original license for a TREC license was a 1-year license, the way the language read, it said this amount of funding specifically would go to the Real Estate Research Center for their funding. And when they moved to a 2-year license, that effectively cut that funding in half. So what we did is we went back in there and we fixed that language to make sure that Texas A&M University was funded according to what was intended, what the legislature intended. Just the fact that TREC changed to a 2-year license shouldn't have changed that. So we fixed that corrected that. And we're real excited to see that the A&M Real Estate Research Center, which does such great research for all of us, supports all of our membership and the industry in such a great way, will be continued in the future with its supported funding. And so that's a big kudos to Senator Menendez for helping us get that bill through the process. And we're thankful that that one is now signed into the law. So another win for Texas Realtors to share. Now, moving on, we can talk about bad bills. Who wants to talk about bad bills? I'll start with the first one, if you like. We can all kind of chime in.
We can collaborate on it.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting conversation for us because we spend so much of our time typically focused on the policy areas that we have actively and proactively wanted to file and make happen for Texas Realtors and for our customers and property owners across the great state of Texas. But we ended up spending an absorbent amount of time this session, maybe even half of our time, fending off bad ideas, bad bills that were filed. And I'll start off with probably the worst offender of this session, which was a ban on foreign buyers to buy real property in Texas. It came out in many forms of bills. SB 147 ended up being the bad guy that started moving and having some traction. What this did was eliminated individuals, companies, and the countries of Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea from having access to Texas real property purchases. It was under the guise of national security. We totally understand the intent there for national security, but when it started dipping down into individual level and going beyond just those countries that would be banned from having access to buying property in Texas, when it started dipping down into the individual, like maybe someone who escaped those regimes and moved to the United States and found Texas as their home to start a new life, to build their family, to build their future generations success here in Texas, that was a bridge too far. And so we opposed that bill, and we worked very hard to oppose that bill. There are different methods on how to oppose bills. We didn't always shout from the rooftops, but there are ways that we can actually use various tactics to make sure our opposition is heard loudly and clearly. And in this case, we worked in opposition to that bill to make sure it didn't pass. And we were successful in making sure it did not clear both houses. So we're excited to say that SB 147 is now dead forever. Hopefully, that idea bad ideas can always come back up, but we will be vigilant about that. But in the form of SB 147, it is dead. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think that it's worth compounding a little bit of what you said, Trey. The legislation in Senate Bill 147 and many of the other bills, as you see there on the screen, there were 6 other bills filed on that topic with varying degrees of proposed restrictions. And they all approached the issue a little bit differently. Some were in the property code and said that this was an exception to property rights in Texas. Others were in our business and commerce code, which effectively deal with, call it contractual law. So that's an oversimplification, but essentially, validating or invalidating certain types of business agreements. Still another or 2 were in the agricultural code and effectively added property ownership in a new way into those chapters. And as Trey said, that legislation was filed under the guise of security. And as Trey said, that's an issue that we understand and our members understand. Many of you probably agree with that. And that was not the debate. The debate was whether the way those bills were written would have put liability on you as real estate professionals, whether it would have put you as real estate professionals or your clients at odds with things like the federal fair housing law, in that you would have to be determining people's nation of origin before you could work with them in a real estate transaction. We were concerned about the way those bills were written because they did not have clear processes in place about how to handle circumstances where a transaction may have occurred that in violation of such a statute, and that could have severe impacts on title and chain of ownership, on the mortgage and lending community, and how those finances are structured. And so all of those things, Texas Realtors needs to be concerned about on your behalf, regardless of the very reasonable interest in making sure that our food supply and our farmlands are protected from hostile actors. So this was not a simple issue for Texas Realtors, and we do there is an anonymous comment in the Q&A saying that was not a bad bill. That is not an uncommon point of feedback that we got on the foreign buyers of real property in Texas issue. But understand that it's our job to make sure that the business of real estate is protected, that you as real estate professionals are protected, and that the opportunity for individuals to purchase real property is protected. And so that's the way we approach those bills. It is possible, as Trey said, that the issue could come back up. It could come back up in the next regular session. It could potentially come back up in a special session. And at that point, Texas Realtors will be prepared to talk about, what works, what doesn't. And we have a very solid coalition of other professional groups in the real estate world and in other business interests that can talk very effectively about the specific nuances and how legislation like this can impact our professions, and why the legislature should be very cautious about that. So that's where those wound up. And I think it's worth also shouting out, Trey, that we did really appreciate the large number of realtors who reached out to Texas Realtors on that issue. We got probably more engagement from our members in the field on this bill than almost any other. Definitely this session, maybe even in recent memory. And one way or another, we're always really glad to see when y'all are paying attention to what the legislature is doing and making sure that us on your behalf are working in the right direction. So thank you for all of y'all and anyone else who might be watching this in the future for your engagement on that. Trey, anything else to say on foreign buyers?
I would just add that we did engage with a lot of our membership groups, our subgroups. We even had meetings with our Asian American realtor friends who understood the intent of the national security issue, which comes why some of y'all might think this is not a bad bill. They felt the same way as about the national security issue. So the art in getting a bill passed that does the right thing and works the right way. So we call it a bad bill in general, yes, but I think the intent there was to make sure that we added our voice to the conversation so that we could craft a bill that would maybe work in that national security idea, but not necessarily be offensive and discriminatory to people living here who are Americans, who have naturalized citizens, other things like that, that wouldn't be barred from buying property here in Texas. So those were some of the nuances. If you start diving into the details, then that's why we started having to work on this bill, because on the surface, some of our members say that that's not a bad bill, haven't gone to the details on how it would actually work and how it would work against how we would engage in real estate and practice here in Texas. So we had to kind of work through some of those issues, and we were fortunate to be able to kind of work through a lot of them. We are prepared if the conversation comes up again to have a version of a bill that we think might be more acceptable. And so we're working in that direction related to the foreign buyer stuff. Also on this list, we have the future right to list contracts. There was a bill about a right to have a 40-year listing, to not provide listing services, and to then also participate in a commission at the end, whether or not you were used for the sale of that property. We felt like that was a problem, and it wasn't right and fair to the consumer or the property owner, and would just add expenses and strip equity away from that property for no provision of service at all, and for no real compensation either. So we felt like that was a problem bill, and made sure that that didn't see the light of day as well. Moving on to the sales leaseback transactions. This was another business practice where maybe you could do a sale leaseback scenario and then have an option to repurchase at the end. This bill would have an option to purchase that had an exorbitant amount of the equity in that property in the sale be set aside for the option to repurchase. So therefore the seller would not get all of the proceeds of the sale back, because maybe 30 or 40% of the sale would go towards this option right to have them have the right to purchase the property back. we felt like that was a stripping of equity again and was not beneficial to the seller. And usually people that would engage in this type of transaction are already in a financial or fiscal problem already. And so you're hitting someone while they're down. We felt like that was a very bad business practice. And so we worked to make sure that those bills did not move forward as well. So any other to add on the bad bills section? If not, we can move on to the next slide.
No, I think, Trey, the only thing I'll say on that is calling back to the statistics that you shared at the beginning, that 0 of the bills that Texas Realtors opposed passed this session. And in fact, Seth, do you want to note the statistics on our opposition?
Yeah, I think, what was it, over the past, I believe 4 or 5 sessions, I think we've had 2 bills that have passed that Texas Realtors has opposed. And one of those was eventually vetoed by the governor. So over the past, I think it was 4 sessions, there's been 1 bill that Texas Realtors has actively opposed that has passed both chambers and been signed into law.
Mm-hmm. So while it's hard to cut through the noise to get bills across the finish line, and that's why we're really excited about the rate of success we have, it's also worth noting when the legislature pays attention to the realtor voice. Bills get filed for all sorts of reasons, not all of them good, some of them well-intentioned, maybe just not particularly well thought out, but it is gratifying for us as your representatives, and hopefully for y'all as Texas Realtors, to know that the legislature does hear when you have concerns, and they take your feedback into account.
Yeah.
All right, on to the fun.
Yeah, so moving on to the property tax bills. So there was a question earlier about where does that money come from? Essentially, it's not from your property taxes. This excess revenues that the state receives, this is money that goes to the state. Property taxes stay at the local area. So the money's the $17 billion in excess revenues that were going to be deployed in some way by the legislature were typically revenues by a high collection of sales taxes, or the oil and gas severance taxes contributed probably the majority of the funds available to the state for the revenue they received. And so it's mostly sales taxes and oil and gas severance taxes that contribute to this excess revenue. So the leadership said, let's put that back, deploy that back to property owners and taxpayers. And so that's why there was questions about, why do we have to spend the money? Well, if it shows up in your balance sheet as a revenue, and then you want to deploy it, it has to show up as an expense item. And so it's just typical, accounting 101 as to how we have to allocate for this. So this is the revenues the state received that were in excess of what they're budgeted for the last biennium. And so now they're trying to redeploy those dollars into some tax savings for property owners. The intent there, that a lot of the conversation that happened in these tax proposals, the one common theme in all of them, there was some method of M&O compression. And if you're not familiar with what that means, that's basically the state paying a higher share of the taxes to fund school financing for your K through 12 school financing. So therefore there was less need to raise more money at the local level. So you're going to see that in a property tax reduction if the state pays a higher amount of the cost of paying for schools. So they call that M&O compression, property tax compression. So every one of the tax proposals had some element of that in it, but then where it varied was some of them had a homestead exemption that they wanted to increase from where it is today at $40,000. The original bill was to increase that to $70,000, and then also add an additional exemption for those over 65. Then the House said, no, let's just take it to $100,000. Then the House also added a appraisal cap that went to 5% across all properties. And so there were those were the varying things that there was disagreement on. And so, but the one common element that the governor seized on when the special session came along was he said, well, let's just make it all 100% compression, because apparently we have agreement on that. We don't have agreement on appraisal caps. We don't have an agreement on homestead exemption. So let's just go 100% compression. Well, that was the governor's push when he opened this special session. After the regular session ended that same night, he called a special session. And that is where we are today. We're in that special. There's still, like we mentioned earlier, there's still leadership dispute, because now the governor and the House and the Speaker are in alignment on 100% compression. Yet the Senate and the Lieutenant Governor are saying, no, we need to have a component of homestead exemption that we need to expand from 40,000 up to 100,000. So there's still disagreement there. And that leads us to where we are today. You want to add any more about the tax proposals that are out there before we get into the whole governor's actions that happened this weekend? Anything else to add?
I think, Trey, and I apologize, I was reading some questions here. Did you explicitly state that Texas Realtors was supporting the Senate plan in the regular session?
I did not, but
Okay.
yeah, the Senate version was an expansion of the homestead. It was also did not have appraisal caps. We've been in opposition to appraisal caps for as long as I remember Texas Realtors being involved in politics. When appraisal caps for residential homesteads came about back in 2015, I believe. Somewhere
1997.
I'm sorry,
For the residents. Yeah.
Yeah. So when that happened, Texas Realtors was in opposition back then. So we've been consistent about opposing any kind of appraisal caps. We always felt like that should be a market number. And where we really have been focusing our efforts is your taxes are really impacted by the amount or growth of the budget of the local taxing entities. And that's where the focus should be, not necessarily on the appraisal side of the equation. That only attributes the proportionate share of the tax bill that you would have to pay. The key element on growing taxes has always been our focus on the budgets of the local taxing entity. So that's why we've been in opposition to caps. And so that's why we were in opposition to the House plan. It didn't succeed, but as soon as the original regular sessions ceased to sine die, when it ended and the governor called a special, the House quickly dropped appraisal caps and moved on with M&O compression. So apparently appraisal caps were not that important. And so maybe they heard our voices. But now there's still some discussion around the homestead exemption expansion idea. So that's where we are. There's still not agreement. The special session is still in
I think
place
before
today.
Trey, before we move on to the special session, there's a question in the chat that I think we can answer
go
live.
for
Norman Gordon asks about how local boards can set their budgets without knowing what the tax rates will be. That's actually how local property taxes are done. The taxing entities, whether they're a school district, a city, a county, or a special taxing district, will go through their budgeting process. They look much like we do in a business environment. They look towards next year, or depending on how they're structured, a longer term planning, and determine how much money they want to spend on what. So they craft a draft budget, and then they come in after that budget process is done, after they've decided their financial priorities and needs, and then they look at the available revenues that they have. Streams of revenue for a city are going to probably include some versions of sales taxes, and some cities bring in more of that than others. And then they look at their property tax roll, and they set a tax rate on your property to meet the budget that they want to collect. So the local taxing entities create their own budgets and set their own tax rates. So what we're talking about here with the compression would not be this year. That would not apply immediately. That would be for future years, because you're right. If the state's going to add more money into public schools, obviously the local entities need time to plan for that, and the state needs time to get that set up. And so that would not be in effect this year. It would be in subsequent years. So that's, hopefully that helps there. All right.
All right, so now we're in a special session, and the item of the special session is about property taxes. And that special session will continue until the 28th, so Wednesday next week. And right now we're in an impasse on which way to go. The House passed their M&O compression bill, 100% M&O compression, which is what the governor asked for. And the Senate is still saying we need $100,000 of a homestead exemption, and then we'll do the rest on compression. So that's where we are today. And in the process of this special session, the governor is trying to exert some leverage to make sure that his property tax proposal gets passed. And part of that leverage has been using what powers he has left, and he has the power to veto. And he exercised that until midnight last night, and he vetoed 76 bills in total, and which means that was a lot. Probably the most he's ever done is what I understand. And so that was 54 Senate bills, 22 House bills, 53 Republican authored bills, and 23 Democratic authored bills. 5 of those bills were bills that we were supporting and were one of our priority issues. 2 of the main ones that were vetoed that are of really stark concern of ours is the Senate Bill 1668 by Brian Hughes. And that was our HOA 2.0 bill, basically. We did some HOA reform last session, and this was an expansion of that HOA reform to include all of those good policy things we put in the HOA legislation last session and bring that forward into condominium associations. Plus, it also tweaks some of the other things that we had done in the bill related to fencing and some of the things like that. Some changes in the architectural control committees that were just correcting some items that were in the last piece of legislation. So we're concerned about that because that was a very hard bill to work on. We spent a lot of time, effort, and energy to get that bill passed, and very disappointed to see that the governor vetoed it. And the reason for vetoing it was for the purposes of just getting someone's attention in the Senate to say, you know, while this bill is important and it has merits, so he acknowledged that, but my intent is to make sure the property tax bill gets passed, and this bill can be revisited in a future special session after my property tax bill initiative gets passed. So that's kind of where we are. He's using his leverage to veto a bill that had nothing to do about the merits of the legislation, but only everything to do about his intent to get the property tax proposal passed. Same rationale he used for SB 1916 by Senator Parker. As you can see, he's focusing on Senate authors, and he's trying to get the attention of the Senate and the Lieutenant Governor by vetoing bills that have nothing to do with bad policy, which is typically the purpose for a veto, but only for the purposes of, we'll take this up later after we get my property tax legislation passed. But this 1916 bill is a bill that we did to improve the situation that we have issues with our membership with, who have a lack of information related to PIDs or public improvement districts. This would put all of that information on your geocoded property information that comes from the Central Appraisal District website. We felt like that was a good business, good government transparency bill, and it really is. And it's just sad to see the governor had vetoed this bill for the purposes of his argument with the Lieutenant Governor. And that's where we are. Do you want to add anything else, Julia?
Think that you covered it. We're hopeful that both of those pieces of legislation and the other 3 that we supported did have good support among the legislature. So we will be able to bring them back. We've already had conversations with both of those authors' offices and also the other stakeholders that we worked on those projects with. Everyone wants to see them continue. So we're just looking to get through this summer and whatever else might come, and hopefully we'll get those done yet this year.
Yeah, I don't want to candy coat the idea that we're not happy about what happened here. We are going to do our best to make sure that we can bring this legislation forward again. And we will work very hard to make sure that happens again when we have the opportunity. But again, I want to share that we are very dismayed and upset that this happened. And we're going to work forward to hopefully find a positive solution to where we can get our legislation, our good policy passed into law. And that's kind of where we are right now. This session will continue until Wednesday, unless it ends sooner. We have no news yet on what the governor's plans are as to how and when he will call another special, but we know another one's coming because his intent is to veto all these bills until he gets a property tax bill passed. So there will be at least one more session for property taxes. He already announced that there will be another special related to vouchers. And then we're assuming there will be another special to fix all of these bills that were vetoed that he promises could be handled in a later special session. So we're looking at least another 3 or 4 special sessions, maybe the rest of this year, talking about legislative priorities. So I don't see any other questions that have yet to be answered that we might not have covered. Does anybody see anything there?
I don't believe so, but of course, if anybody has additional questions, I think we can spend a few more minutes here trying to answer those. And you and all of your colleagues are always welcome to reach out to us offline and ask additional questions as you need. Otherwise, send good thoughts, send jokes while we spend our summer in the Capitol.
All right. I think we have one more slide to jump on here real quick. Here we go. All right, here's a couple ideas that we did not get through the bicameral system of the House and the Senate that we are planning on working on during the interim. This top bill here is another PID-related bill that was more of a transactional fix bill. Like, for example, if there's a PID in your area and the city or the county has not published it online or made that available publicly, then you cannot be, the seller cannot be penalized, or the buyer will not have a right to terminate, because if that information is not publicly available, then there's no way for people to know about it. So therefore they can't terminate a contract under this statute. So we were trying to make that fix. And then additionally on this next piece, this is a House bill by Representative Wally. It was a tenant bill about flood disclosure. And so we were just trying to clean up some of the transactional ways that happens. You know, for example, if you do a sale leaseback, do you have to tell the tenant that it's potentially in a flood zone? Well, you just bought this house from them and they probably already know. So do we need to give them a disclosure for that purpose? So there's conversations around some of those things that we wanted to fix. And this last one is another issue that we're going to bring into an interim conversation, hopefully, and that's related to model subdivision laws. We worked on this bill during session. Typically, a bill, like we said earlier, only about 15% of them pass this session, but typically it takes multiple sessions to get a good idea or a bill passed. And in this case, this one has general opposition to it. But the idea there is we're trying to help people that are landlocked into ownership of a property. They can't sell it because it's currently not set up properly or able to sell it under the current model subdivision laws. It's an illegal transaction if they try to sell it. And so we're trying to help people get out from under this legal hurdle that they have before they can sell a piece of property, and just help some of these transactions happen. So some of these ideas we're going to work on during the interim, and I'll invite the rest of the team to close and add any closing comments and ideas.
Sure. And there's a couple of new questions in the chat. Cassandra Davis asks about the DEI law, and do we see that being extended to businesses at some point? Cassandra, I believe you're talking about a Senate bill that looked at diversity, equity, inclusion programming at our state universities and prohibiting those universities from having DEI offices. Of course, we can never predict what the legislature may or may not do, but we can tell you that thus far, the conversation around diversity programming has not extended to private businesses. For better or for worse, Texas has always been a state that is very supportive of business and professional communities, and adding state law that really regulates to that level what private businesses can do is not typically something that the legislature that's not typically a line the legislature is willing to cross. So I don't think we would expect to see, not that there might not be a bill filed, but unlikely that one might be passed that did something like that. Sue, then there was another question, Shanita Brown, thank you for Shanita asking for whether there's anything you can do to help. The best thing you and any other Texas realtor can do to help is to stay engaged. The fact that you're here listening to this webinar is a huge step. We love when our members are able to make that level of engagement. Keep paying attention, read our messages that come up, whether it's Texas Realtors Weekly Focus or our magazines or our legislative liaison. If you're not on that list, we'll get you signed up on it. We try to make sure we limit things like calls for action when we ask you and fellow realtors from around the state to reach out to your elected officials and ask them to vote for or against legislation. There's a lot of reasons for that, but primarily when we do that, we want them to be impactful. We don't just do them to do them. And so if there is a very good reason for us to issue a call for action, you'll definitely hear about it. And that you can be very helpful by responding to that. And in the long term, just make sure you're involved. Come to your local association meetings where you can, come to ours. And your voice really matters in the room. So Kevin Finch asked about Senate Bill 369, and you'll have to forgive us. We memorize a lot of numbers.
Yeah, that one's related to the disannexation of certain areas that do not receive full municipal services, providing a civil.
Okay.
And that one did not get through the process.
It did not. It looks like it ran out of time on the House calendar. So it's certainly possible that the legislators who worked on that was authored by Senator Campbell, certainly possible that we could see her bring that back. Oftentimes it takes a couple of runs for legislation to pass. So very possible. Bill Evans asked, I believe Morgan can probably answer this question, but the peak number that I saw on this call was 200 attendees, and thank you all for being here.
Yeah, and the last question was, can we expect a regular updates? We will do these as often as we possibly can. Likely once a property tax bill gets passed, we'll probably send some at least some notices, some if you're not on the legislative liaison list, you might want to go to the Texas Realtors website and sign up to be on our legislative liaison to get newsletters from us on a regular basis about what's happening at the legislature. And that'll be helpful information. We will likely probably have another webinar later this year to update you all on where we are on the session. And then don't forget, we have conference coming up in September too. So we'll have plenty of opportunities for more updates as we move along through the year. And we really do appreciate your attendance today. And is there anything else that we see?
I saw one other question about the possibility of sharing the slides and also linking the recording. Morgan will count on you to answer that question. And we will talk about the best option for sharing slides or some other version of these slides. In the meantime, you are welcome to contact any of us to get particular details that you might need. We have a group email handle if it helps, and you can email us all at lobby LOBBY at texasrealtors.com, and that will get all of us at once, so you don't have to worry about our individual contacts.
All right, I'm just looking at the questions real quick. Yeah, I see a comment about other revenues, property tax. Absolutely, the additional revenue that the state received during this last biennium, which created the excess revenues, is tax dollars. But the source of those dollars wasn't property taxes. It was from sales taxes and severance taxes. But the leadership has intent to redeploy those monies back into property taxpayers' savings. So that's a good thing. And we're excited about where that ultimately would go. When there will be a property tax bill passed, we will see some great savings for property tax payers. So we're looking forward to that as well. But I don't see any new questions. So thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And we look forward to the next time we get the opportunity to visit. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Enjoy your week. Thank you so much.